Seville, Spain, August 22, 1559. In a private chamber, within the Inquisition's headquarters, a man named Dr. Rodrigo Alvarez sits chained to a wooden chair studded with iron spikes. He is 51 years old, a respected physician who had treated both Christian and converso families for 3 decades. His crime, if it can be called that, was being too educated, too rational, too willing to question interpretations of Scripture during dinner conversations with other intellectuals. Someone at one of those dinners had reported him for expressing doubts about certain church doctrines. That single conversation, held in what he thought was private company, had been enough to bring him before the tribunal. Dr. Alvarez had been a Christian his entire life. His family had converted 3 generations earlier. He had studied medicine at the University of Salamanca, had written treatises on anatomy that were respected throughout Spain, had saved countless lives through his skill and knowledge. None of that mattered now. The Inquisition cared nothing for his contributions to medical science or his decades of faithful church attendance. What mattered was that he had questioned, and questioning was heresy. He had been in their custody for 11 weeks. They had interrogated him repeatedly, demanding he recant statements he barely remembered making, asking him to denounce books he had read, insisting he provide names of others who had participated in those intellectual discussions. He had refused, not out of stubbornness, but out of principle. He would not condemn innocent people to save himself. He would not pretend that curiosity and intellectual inquiry were sins against God. The torture had escalated gradually, following procedures outlined in manuals that inquisitors studied as carefully as Dr. Alvarez had once studied medical texts. They had started with stress positions, forcing him to kneel for hours while holding heavy stones. When that failed to break him, they moved to thumb screws, crushing his fingers one by one until several bones cracked and his hands became useless, swollen masses of purple flesh. Still, he refused to provide the confession they demanded. So they brought him to this chair, stripped him to the waist, and strapped him in so tightly that every breath drove dozens of iron spikes into his back, chest, and arms. A brazier had been placed beneath the chair, heating the metal until the spikes became searing points that burned as they pierced. Dr. Alvarez had spent his career understanding human anatomy, treating injuries, alleviating pain. Now that knowledge became a curse, he understood exactly what was happening to his body. He knew which tissues were tearing, which blood vessels were being punctured, how long a human being could survive this particular combination of injuries. The chief inquisitor, a younger man named Father Gabriel, who seemed to take personal offense at Dr. Alvarez's refusal to break, stood before the chair with a document in his hands. "You need only sign this confession," Father Gabriel said, his voice tight with frustration. "Admit that you question the holy mysteries of our faith. Provide the names of others who participated in your heretical discussions. Denounce the books that led you astray. Do this, and the torture ends. You will face penance, perhaps imprisonment, but you will live." Dr. Alvarez looked at the document through eyes blurred by pain and blood loss. He knew what signing would mean. It would not just destroy his own reputation and future. It would condemn a dozen other men, scholars and physicians and lawyers who had done nothing worse than engage in intellectual discussion over dinner. It would validate the Inquisition's assumption that curiosity itself was dangerous, that questioning was equivalent to heresy. He thought about his wife, who had died 5 years earlier of fever he had been unable to cure despite all his medical knowledge. He thought about his daughter, married now and living in Portugal, safe from the Inquisition's reach. He thought about the hundreds of patients he had treated, the lives he had saved, the suffering he had alleviated, and he thought about what it meant to be human, to possess a mind capable of wonder and doubt and questioning. In that moment, burning and bleeding in a torture chair, Dr. Rodrigo Alvarez made his final diagnosis. The Inquisition could destroy his body, but it could not touch the essential truth that made him human: his capacity to think, to question, to refuse complicity in the destruction of other innocent people, that remained inviolate no matter what they did to his flesh. He looked at Father Gabriel and spoke through cracked and bleeding lips. "I have nothing to confess. I have harmed no one. I have questioned interpretations of doctrine. Yes, because God gave me a mind capable of thought. If using that mind is heresy, then I am guilty. But I will not lie to save myself. I will not condemn innocent men. Do what you will." The silence that followed was profound. Father Gabriel's face flushed with anger and something else, something that might have been fear or doubt or recognition that his certainty was not as absolute as he pretended. The executioner looked uncertain, waiting for orders. For a long moment, the machinery of the Inquisition paused, confronted by one man's quiet refusal to participate in his own destruction or the destruction of others. Then Father Gabriel nodded, and the executioner tightened the straps, driving the spikes deeper. Dr. Alvarez died in that chair 3 hours later, never having signed the confession, never having provided the names they demanded. The Inquisition recorded him in their archives as an obstinate heretic who died unrepentant, a warning to others who might consider questioning church authority. But they could not record what actually happened in that chamber. That one man, facing agony designed to break the human spirit, had chosen integrity over survival. That he had looked at the machinery of institutional cruelty and refused to let it turn him into an instrument of others' destruction. The Spanish Inquisition continued for nearly 3 more centuries. Finally abolished in 1834, thousands suffered in its chambers. Most broke under torture and confessed to whatever crimes their interrogators imagined. Some, like Isabel Mendoza and Dr. Rodrigo Alvarez, held onto something the Inquisition could not touch. Not defiance exactly, but a quiet insistence on truth even when truth meant death. Their names survive only in administrative records, brief notations in documents that reduce human tragedy to bureaucratic efficiency. But their choices echo across centuries, asking us to consider what we would do when systems of power demand we choose between survival and integrity, between saving ourselves and condemning others, between the truth we know and the lies that might set us free. What do you think, in their position, facing that impossible choice, what would you have done? And perhaps more importantly, do similar systems exist today that demand we choose between conscience and compliance? Share your thoughts in the comments. These conversations matter because the questions raised by the Inquisition's victims are not safely confined to history. They remain urgent in every age, including our own.